All right, everyone, this is Daniel K. Bbeltdan, and welcome to the third and final part of how to make a latex mask. In the first episode, we went ahead and we did the head casts that we're going to be using to sculpt the mask on, and in part two, we sculpted the mask and we created this two-part mold that we're going to be using to pour the liquid latex in. So in this episode, we're now going to take that liquid latex, put these two together, pour the latex in, and start either, depending on if I have enough latex, I'm either just going to let it sit and let it slowly develop the thickness that we need, or I'm just going to have to start doing multiple layers of slush casting in order to try to develop the thickness that we are needing. So I'll have to probably see. The type of liquid latex I'm going to be using is going to be this stuff right here. Plus I also have some other stuff that should still be pretty good. Now it says it's general purpose latex. When I bought it, it told me it was mask making latex, which is mask making latex is the type of latex you want to use. However, this would still work because this is what I've used for my Cenobite costume or mask, which is 2 years old, going on 3 years old, and it is still in pretty good condition. So I think just for this particular case, this should still work. So let's go ahead and get right to it. So to start off this tutorial, we have the two-part negative mold that we made in the last episode, and I'm taking some latex, and I'm doing the first initial layer just by pouring it in and moving it around with a brush, just so I can make sure that there's a consistent layer. After that dries, I go ahead and I take the two halves, I put them together, and I'm using this strap here that you get at any kind of hardware store to strap it together to try to keep the two pieces solid so they don't come apart while I'm doing the slush cast. To make sure it's nice and tight so it doesn't split open. And then after you are done with that, then you're going to go ahead and take some more of your liquid latex and just pour it straight in. Now what I'm doing is a slush cast of this, is where it's just, as it says, you just pour it in and just slush it around. And I did this with the Cenobite mask and I got some pretty good results. The results this time around wasn't as good as I was hoping, and it could have been because of either bad latex, or maybe it's just inconsistencies, I don't know, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But just slushing it around, and I pour in some more, slush it around some more, and you want to do this several times to try to get a good thick layer. I mean, you know, the more layers that you put in, the more times you do this, the thicker it is, and you'd want it to be thick. You don't want it to be super thin, or else it's going to split on you. And just to make sure that I'm getting it towards the edges, I go ahead and just brush some of that liquid latex around to the edges, just to, you know, make sure that, especially like I said, around the edges, you want it to be nice and thick. From this point, I'm taking some baby powder and I'm putting it in because I don't want the latex to stick to itself. And I just get a hair dryer and I just blow it all out, you know, to make sure that the entire inside is covered with that baby powder before I try to start removing it. So the latex, if any of it is still wet, will stick to itself. I go ahead and put my hand in to try to get it initially separated, at least on one side of the mold, before I split the two molds together so I don't potentially rip the latex. As I separate the molds and I remove the band that is holding it together, and I get the back portion off very carefully, making sure that I don't, you know, rip the latex, and continue removing it out of the mold. Now, unless your mold is 100%, which is probably not ever going to be 100% airtight around the seams, you're going to have a little bit of flashing that you're going to have to remove. So don't be surprised if that comes out, but you can easily cut that off. And there's the mask. It's unpainted at this point in time, but at least I have an idea. I'm looking at it, seeing if there's any little pockets or air holes, or, you know, air bubbles that might have made some holes inside it, or if there's anything. Just looking at the mask in general, and from here I'm removing a bunch of that flashing. First, I'm just using some scissors, going around trying to cut off at least the main portion of it. Eventually, later on, I'll go in and remove it with a Dremel. Here I'm removing a lot of that flashing at the bottom that it's not necessary, and I try to make sure that to the edges, as I was saying earlier, you want those edges to be nice and thick because that's where you're potentially going to get some tears. Here I'm going ahead and cutting the holes open for the mouth, so I'm hoping to try to have it to where there could be a little bit of, you know, mouth movement. He can open up and close his mouth, and the mouth of the mask will open up. Here is the holes that I'm cutting in for the nose so he can breathe through his nose if he has his mouth closed. And eventually we'll do the same thing with the eyes. We'll cut some holes for the eyes so he can see through and everything. So here it is. I'm using a Dremel with a little bit of a stone sanding block. And you want to be very, very careful. If you go a little bit too hard on it, you're going to end up tearing right through it. So after all that, this is the point of where we're at right now. I've managed to successfully remove all the flashing and sanding it down. I went through and I repaired a couple of areas that I found either they were too thin or there were some holes. We even had a tear, and I was able to go back and patch that back up. Just put on more latex and you're able to do that. And I put it back onto the head bust that we made of my son. So now it's the time for me to go ahead and paint it. So to do that, to paint it, we're going to go first and give it a nice little wash of a base color first. And then I'll go in and touch up on some of the extra details. So let's get to that. Okay, so now we're getting to the part where we get to paint it. To mix up the paint, I'm using some rubber cement to try to make as a binder, and I'm using some of this naphtha to kind of thin it out, and I mix those two together to get this base here that I use. And with that base, I use some oil paints to mix together to try to get the tint of the color that I'm wanting. I know there's other methods that you can do this with, and I've seen people use acrylic and latex paint, which that would work. I use that in a Cenobite mask, but I'm trying this. I saw this online, so I thought I'd probably give it a try. So I'm now mixing up the base coat, which I want to try to get as close to kind of a, not necessarily a flesh tone, but more of kind of an under flesh tone. I don't know if you ever seen, like, if you ever get a scar and that first couple of layers of new flesh starts to kind of, heal over the scar area. That's the kind of color that I'm looking for here, and I get it. Mix in some of that base that I've made with the rubber cement and naphtha and start brushing it on. And actually the first layer turns out very well. The one thing I like about with the way, I don't know if it's this particular type of color, but the way that I'm doing it is that you have a little bit subsurface scattering effect going on, so I just go through and I'm just brushing the whole mask on with just this base layer before I start going ahead and adding in the little details, making sure I get every little nook and cranny, every little bit of the latex. Once I go with that, I mix up another color, and this right here is more of the flesh tone. And I'm going through, and I'm not going to paint the whole thing, just the areas of where there is some flesh that is left on this particular character's face. I do it the exact same way that I did with the last paint. Just took the colors that I needed of the oil colors and mixed it together until I got the tint, and mixed in some of that rubber cement naphtha base that I made, and I just start using a paintbrush to paint it on. And you can go through with just a paintbrush and do this entire process, but for this particular mask I decided to try expanding my resources, so to say, and I decided to try something out for the very first time. Still don't know whether if it turned out well or not, but we'll be the judge towards the end. So I just go through the whole mask, coloring it with that flesh color right there, as you can see. And now I'm going to go ahead and start putting in a lot of the extra details. And for this part, I'm actually going to go ahead and take it outside into my wife's shop, where she has my airbrush kit. And so now I'm going to use an airbrush kit to go ahead and start putting in the details. So I mix up some of that paint, but I thin it down a whole lot using that same naphtha material. And now I'm going through, and I want to try to get the open wounds, the bloody open wounds available, and really make those pop. So I'm going through with a very bright color red, and well, actually it's not a bright red. I do the bright red a little bit later, but I go in with a little bit of this kind of a reddish pinkish color to kind of brighten that up a little bit to make a good contrast to the dark areas that I'll be applying a little bit later. I'm going through now with that same airbrush, and I'm trying to be very, very careful with it as I go through with the paint, and I'm putting in some bright colors. So once again, for a little bit of contrast, to get a little bit of the areas of where there's some blood and stuff that we should be seeing. And once I go through with that, Now I'm going to go through with, from the highlights, I'm going to go through with some of the shadows. So I mix up some dark colors and really thin it out to where it's almost kind of a bit of a water, and I brush it in and I try to wipe off as much as I can, leaving the darker colors mostly inside all the little crevices and the nooks and crannies. And as we see here, we have the mask fully painted, and now we have my son that has tried on the mask with his costume that he's planning to go out for Halloween. So I think it turned out very well with the costume. The mask really adds to it. It's very form-fitting to his face, which is what we were wanting. It's not too loose or anything. So I think it turned out very well. Y'all let me know what y'all think. Alright everyone, and there you have it, the completed mask, latex mask. Throughout this entire 3-part episode, we went ahead and we did a life cast of the subject's head. We used that to sculpt the mask on and make this negative mold that we used to pour the liquid latex in that got us this mask that we went ahead and detailed and painted. So what do y'all think? If y'all haven't figured it out by now, it's supposed to be Freddy Krueger from the Nightmare on Elm Street. He wanted it to look more like from the part 6, and I think we did a pretty decent job. Now, is it perfect? No, it's not, but that's all part of this process, is for me to try to learn from the mistakes, and I did make some mistakes, but I've learned a lot of things, so the mask is only going to get better. Some of the things that I've learned, such as, for one, if all you had is one of these smaller bottles here of liquid latex, the slush cast will work, and I think it worked very well with my Cenobite mask. On this one, though, it didn't work as well as I was hoping because we got inconsistent thickness. There were still a couple of holes, and I even ended up getting a big tear right back here that you could see that I thought I could patch up, but it's starting to kind of open back up. So the best alternative would be to just buy, if you're planning on doing this a lot, is to buy maybe a big gallon of latex or enough of those bottles to where you could probably fill the mold all the way up and let it sit for a little bit so it has a nice even edge all around the mold, and then drain it out, and then you should have an even thickness all throughout the mask and a consistent thickness, so it hopefully would avoid having holes pop up and possibly weak spots to where it can tear when you're trying to slide it over. The paint job is okay. I think I could do a much better job. I'm still learning how to use the airbrush, and as I get better at that, I think I'll get a much better result. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of little things in here, but considering how this was maybe only the second time that I've ever made a mask like this, I think it turned out very well. What do y'all think? But with that being said, that concludes this 3-part episode. I hope that y'all have learned something, at least in one of the 3 episodes. No, that is not us reenacting an episode from Texas Chainsaw. That's my wife sanding something down. So she gets mad if I interrupt her, so I'll just have to talk over that. But still, once again, hope that y'all learned something throughout one of these 3 episodes. I definitely did. And thank y'all for coming along on this little journey of mine. So everyone, I just want to say thank y'all for watching. My name is Daniel, aka Bbeltdan. This concludes the How to Make a Latex Mask series. Thank y'all for watching, and I will see you next time.